When I was in seminary at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on nice summer evenings, we would walk into Harvard Square and have dinner. We didn't do it that often because we were poor grad students. And there was a Pizzeria Uno there. And I remember one time me and a couple friends, we'd had dinner there, and we were making our way back through Harvard Square, which, especially on like a Friday or Saturday night in the summer, is it's I don't know, it's a little bohemian. There's like people just playing guitars out. There's also a lot of runaway teenagers in New England seem to wind up in Harvard Square. Plus you have all the like wicked smart kids, or if I were to say it in my Boston, wicked smart kids. The wicked smart kids from Harvard are out, and MIT and anyway, my friends and I were, after having dinner, we're walking back to campus, and I remember that this guy was sort of approaching us, and he was obviously homeless. And I say obviously because we know what somebody who's homeless kind of looks like, right? They're not showered. Their clothes are very dirty, right? And he appeared to be sort of talking to himself. And he seemed very intent on me, and he was like making eye contact with Cheyenne. He was like making eye contact with me and kind of talking to himself. And I was scared, right? And so I like looked down, and I'm like trying to walk faster, and then once we passed, I realized I heard what he was saying. He wasn't talking to himself; he was talking to me. And he said, "Lady, I'll tell you a poem if you give me your leftovers." And like when that hit me, when I realized what he had said, like I just stopped, like dead in my tracks. And my friends kept walking. They probably were 10 feet ahead, and then they turned around. They were like, what's going on? And then I started to like run back through the crowd. I was like, who wants a stranger's cold leftovers, right? But I'm running through the crowd trying to find this person to give him my food, because it no longer felt like mine. It felt like it should be his, right? To be that hungry to approach somebody and ask for their leftovers, right? And I couldn't find him. I couldn't find him in the crowd, mostly because I barely looked at him. Okay? And like I felt, I was in seminary. I was like, I'm supposed to be going to school to take care of the least, the lost, the left behind, right? And I didn't even look at him like he should have dignity and respect, right? I was afraid. I was afraid because he was homeless. Truthfully, I was also afraid because he was black, right? I was afraid for my safety, even though it was like a very crowded summer night and I was with friends, right? And that's what labels do to us, right? That's what stereotypes do to us. They rob people of their belovedness, of their humanity, of their being a child of God. Right? And so when Jesus and the disciples cross over the Sea of Galilee in their boat and they arrive in the area of the Gerasenes in Gerasenes on the other side of the lake, I wonder what stereotypes that they carried with them in the boat. Okay? You all don't know this without studying your Bible, but Gerasenes, being on the other side of the Lake of Galilee, meant it was it was still Palestine, but it was where the Romans had settled. And there were 10 Roman cities called the Decapolis over there, right? So they were Gentiles, right? And so the Jewish disciples traveling over, and we don't know why, right? We don't know why they traveled over, but they must have carried with them some of their own stereotypes, right? We're Jewish, they're not. We're better, they're not, right? And then they're met by this man living outside of the city, right? Luke tells us he's homeless, right? He's naked. He's living in the tombs, right? He's like the Walking Dead, really, living with his mental illness. And I wonder what labels the disciples and Jesus brought when they met him, right? Were they afraid? Were they, did they think he deserved to be there, right? Did they think he, he was naked. They must have had, try to avert their eyes, right? Were they afraid that he might enact violence upon them, right? We're told, Luke tells us, the man was so, the city tried to restrain him, right? He says to protect him from himself, right? But maybe also to protect them from him. Right? And he didn't want that kind of protection, so he went and lived off by himself. And I find it really interesting that after Jesus heals the man, okay, how do the townspeople react? They're afraid, right? They're afraid. They're afraid because this man that they had labeled as naked, homeless, mentally ill, now wasn't. He didn't have their labels anymore, and they didn't know how to respond to him or to interact with him. Because that's often what we do as people, right? Once we label somebody as one thing, it's hard for us to erase that label, erase those stereotypes. So we like to listen to people who just reinforce our own stereotypes, don't we? And it's so much easier to do now, right? Because you can just go online and follow the people that you want, that say the same kind of things that you want and perpetuate the same kinds of stereotypes and give you the information that will just keep you the same, right? Because when things change, we get scared, right? Several years ago, we one of the things that our youth group likes to do is on Thanksgiving weekend, the weekend before Thanksgiving, we go to Chester East Side to put together Thanksgiving meal bags, and then go back on Sunday to help hand out the turkeys and the meal bags to people. For those of you who've been to CEI, it's down, there's no elevator or anything, it's just down a flight of stairs. And, could you imagine trying to carry a 25-pound turkey and 2 bags of canned goods, up those stairs by yourself? No. You need help. You need young people, right? And I remember one year we were there, and one of the kids, she was sticking to me like glue. And I kept going go help. And she was like, I'm afraid. she's like, she didn't know. All she knew was what she, well, probably heard from her parents, right? That Chester is not a safe place, right? And it's not, right? I mean, there's more violent crime that happens there. Even though it's lower than it used to be, but still, this label we have is, right? I mean, murder capital of the world. I remember that when I first was thinking about moving down somewhere, and I was like, oh, I've heard of Chester, right? Murder capital of the world. But as we were there, and I was like, please go carry that turkey for that little old lady, she realized there was really nothing to be afraid of, at least where we were at. And the people were not anybody to be afraid of. Right? She had her labels and her stereotypes, and those needed to be erased so she could just see them as people, as who they were, right? The letter to the Galatians, that passage that we had today, Galatians is one of the oldest parts of the New Testament that we have. The first letter to the Thessalonians, maybe a little bit older. But it was written, Paul wrote it about 15 years after Jesus' death. And scholars think that the part that we heard today comes perhaps from a baptismal service. Okay? Now, Paul writes, as he writes most of his letters, because there's a problem in the church community. Right? He's like, God is love, just be nice. I'm going to go tell more people. And he leaves. And then people start saying, the left side of the room is, well, I guess you guys are here. The left side of the room is better. The right side are horrible. We get all the good food. You guys get nothing, right? And then Paul has to write him a letter, and he's like, I told you, right? The good news of God. Just love each other. So the parts of the letter to Galatians right before this one, people are trying to divide themselves into different factions. And it has to do with circumcision, that because Jewish men, Jewish baby boys, 8 days old, are circumcised as part of the covenant promise that God said to Abraham. That's why they do that. They're marking on their body the promise of their life to God, right? And Jesus was Jewish, and Paul was Jewish, and the disciples were all Jewish, right? So once we start preaching to non-Jewish people, all the Jewish people are like, men need to be circumcised, right? And Paul is basically saying, no, you don't need to. Do it if you want, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But we don't need to do these kinds of things that label us like those who are circumcised are better than those who aren't. Right? That's when he says there is no longer Jew or Greek. That's really what he's saying, right? The circumcised and the uncircumcised, right? The different labels that we try and separate ourselves into, the different factions, the different groups, which one's better? And so this phrase, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female. Scholars think that might have been the words that would have been said over somebody when they were baptized into Christ, into the life of Christ. Okay? Like, this is what it means to be Christian. Right? This is what it means to follow Jesus. We're going to erase the labels and distinctions and stereotypes. But the original Greek doesn't actually use the phrase no longer. Okay? This is what that makes it sound like whenever you say there is no longer Jew or Greek. It sounds like there used to be, right? There used to be Jewish and Gentile, and baptism erases it. What the original Greek actually says is there is no Jew or Greek. The phrase actually means it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Okay? Meaning in creation, God didn't create us with these divisions. Okay? God didn't create us with religious divisions. We were created to be one. God didn't create us so that one group could oppress another group. God created us to be one. In creation, God didn't create us to be separated into different kinds of genders. Right? We were to be one. And that's the truest truth that we have. And what we need to do is ground ourselves in that truth, return to that truth. Because right now, we spend so much time and energy hating each other, stereotyping each other, dividing each other. And everybody loses at that game. Everybody loses at that game. And we can even see this, like social psychologists study this. Our happiness is decreasing. We're richer than ever. Shouldn't money make us happier? Right? We're fatter than ever, right? We got more food. We're not struggling in life as much, right? We should be happier, but we're not, right? We're more isolated. We're more afraid. We're more alone. We're more negative. But the truest truth that we have in our baptism and in our creation as God's children is that the one God who created us in love wants us to live as one with each other. And then all those other distinctions that we use, race, socioeconomics, class, education level, gender, sexuality, right? Politics, part of the country we live in, sports team you root for, right? All of it. All of it. Just one in God. And the more we can live into that, the more we're living into God's good news.